Hello. Today I want to react to this Joseph Folley interview. Well, it's actually not an interview. It's more like a debate. It's him versus Nathan Hawkins, who's this Christian philosopher guy. I don't know much about him. But they're going to talk about free will, and I know Joe Folley is going to take this compatibilist position that I think is different from other stuff I've heard before. So I'm kind of intrigued, kind of curious, because I've heard Joe Folley talk free will with Alex O'Connor before. So yeah, I'm just curious to see what's going to happen here, and we'll keep an open mind for sure. And yeah, let's just get into it. I saw a couple minutes into it before, which is how I know the kind of like vague position he's going to take, but I don't know exactly what either of these two guys' positions are. So let's see. It's going to be pretty cool.
Do we have free will, or are our actions ultimately determined? I'm John Nelson, and today on Unbelievable, I'm joined by two philosophers who have thought deeply about this perennial question. Joe Folley studied philosophy at Cambridge and hosts Unsolicited Advice, a YouTube channel devoted to a philosopher who received his PhD from Cambridge, where he teaches. He also makes videos on his YouTube channel, so do check them out as well. Joe and Nathan, it's wonderful to have you on Unbelievable.
Nice to be here.
Thanks very much.
We were talking about before the show about how the stars have finally aligned because you were studying at Cambridge at the same time and didn't come across each other. And you've spoken online, but it's wonderful to have you in person.
Yes.
Yes, it's great to be here.
I know that
We'll just watch the
sort of
introductions,
analytic
it's okay.
philosopher types love definitions. And I think when we come to this debate about free will, I suppose there are sort of three main camps. I was reading this morning, as a theologian does, the 2020 Phil survey, which surveys a huge number of philosophers. And broadly speaking, it seems like philosophers fall into three main camps. Around 19% accept something called libertarianism, around 60%, so maybe the mainstream view, accept or lean towards compatibilism, and around 11% accept or lean towards the view that we have no free will, whilst others remain undecided or...
Compatibilism just seems like a total nothing burger to me, basically. The way I've heard people talk about it, and also I want to say this, I see an intellectual flimsiness when it comes to the issue of free will, the philosophical issue of free will, in a way that I really don't see in any other topic, and it's kind of funny, right? Like the arguments I'll hear people make, more so from the side claiming that there is free will, they're really emotional, really intuitive. They're not deep at all. And what I mean deep, they almost don't even feel a desire to challenge their own arguments. They almost see that it's not necessary. And I think the compatibilists are often this way. They will be like, okay, yeah, my actions are influenced, which, you know, if my intent behind my actions, if I didn't intend that, right? The underlying cause or somewhere along in the causal chain, it's not my own. Okay, that would makes sense then that we don't have free will, but they're like, oh yeah, but you know what, I feel like at the end of the day it's still me doing it. They say something along those lines. It's very elementary, and so they say, oh, we have here and here, and they try to have their cake and eat it too, and it just seems implausible, and it seems very low level. And I'll say I really only see that type of argumentation when it comes to free will, or I'll see it in other places, but not to the same extent and not as boldly. So that's kind of interesting, and I think compatibilism is often this way. I'll see what Joe Folley says though, because I've heard him make great points in the past, so I'm curious if he's able to spin it in a new, interesting manner.
Like a combination of views. So Joe, I was wondering, to start off with, could you give us a brief introduction to the three main positions: libertarianism, compatibilism, and the view that we have no free will?
Yeah, so there's libertarian free will, as far as I understand it, is broadly defined, takes a definition of free will along a couple of different ideas. First, there is the alternative possibilities aspect to it, which some people say is sufficient, some people say it's necessary, other people say it's neither necessary nor sufficient, as is often the case with philosophers. And that suggests that, you know, given a decision, if you were to wind back the clock and play the decision again, it could have gone in another direction. So, you know, somebody says, John, would you like a cup of tea? You say yes. Wind back the clock. John, would you like a cup of tea? No, thank you. That would be like an alternative possibility open to you. The other aspect of libertarian free will, again, some people lean more heavily on this, some people don't lean that heavily on this, is the sourcehood conception, which is the idea that we are, in some sense, the source of our actions. That, in some sense,
I think this is the more pertinent component.
quite important, because what sense is kind of up for debate a little bit. Is it being the ultimate source of your actions? Does that matter? I think that might be slightly too high a bar to jump over. But there are many different ways you can kind of cash that out. Incompatibilist determinism is the idea that those two conceptions of free will are in some sense correct. They're saying that is what free will would amount to, but they don't in fact hold. And often the thing they're leaning on there is a conception of the world whereby everything is determined either causally or non-causally. And maybe we can talk about the difference between non-causal and causal determinism, because they sound very similar, but they tug you in quite different directions. And yeah, they'd argue that because of that, or because of that plus some jiggling around, some related factors, those two, either both or one of those two conditions don't hold, and so we don't have free will. And then a compatibilist position, which is broadly the kind of position I align with, or maybe a slightly unorthodox version of it, holds that there are some important senses of either freedom or willing or both that would hold even if you couldn't do otherwise, and even if you weren't the ultimate source of your actions. So, if you weren't to kind of...
So apparently, even if, and this is that elementary, little playful, whimsical style I was talking about earlier when it comes to compatibilism. Looks like Joe Folley's not doing anything crazy here. He says, even if both of those deterministic elements are true, even if you are not the original source of your actions, and really if you're not the original source, what does that mean? Like the source, what is the source of something? The source is the original element. So if you're not the original source, it's kind of like a redundant. You can just say if you're not the source, right? If you're not the original source of something, you're not the source of something. So, okay, so we're not the source of our actions. And then he said it couldn't have even gone any other way. He's granting that deterministic aspect as well. So not only are you not the source of what you actually do or want, but you have, he's just granted that there's no other possible alternate reality in which you could have done something else. And he says, there is some important sense, there is some meaningful sense in which we have a sense of freedom. It's like, your sense of freedom, that's you, that's your ego, and you feel that you're having an effect on reality, and you are. But when we're actually making logical arguments on philosophical issues, we need a little bit more than that emotional aspect. And he looks like he's going right back to that sense of compatibilism that I've seen before, which is not so intellectually serious.
Well, somebody said a causa sui, but also that's not necessarily a framing that a libertarian would subscribe to. So, for instance, my compatibilist position, I don't think we should think of compatibilism as rescuing the same idea of free will as the libertarian thinks. I think we should think of it as asking something like, what are the relevant and important notions of freedom and will that either survive determinism or are just totally orthogonal to the metaphysics here? So there are, I think, one of my points that I hope to get across is that there are very, very important notions of freedom and notions of willing, some of which are kind of very obvious and some of which aren't so obvious, that are unrelated to whether we are in a deterministic universe or a stochastic universe or a universe where humans do act in some libertarian sense, at least some of the time. There are important notions of freedom that are apart from this, some of which people have heard of, some of which people might not have heard of. So I'm interested to talk about that a bit.
And Nathan, where do you stand on the free will debate?
So I'm a libertarian, and I pretty much recognise what Joe has said as a sort of a good description of that. And really, I think that what that is it's taking seriously our phenomenal experience. I think whenever we're coming to make a decision, certainly in cases where we're kind of not acting on autopilot, where we had that sort of experience of being in control or having made a decision and acted on it, our experience is that we sort of consider our options. There seem to be several options. We take those options seriously. We think these are genuine things that we can do or could refrain from doing. And then we have, on top of that, a selection of deciding, that's what I'm going to do. And then we do it. So I think the libertarian free will position is certainly the most intuitive. It certainly seems to be the one that captures best our phenomenal experience of being the agent at the center of our lives.
It's true, it does seem intuitive. Tell me there's more to your position, though, that you're not just going to lead with that. Or rather, tell me that you are just going to lead with that you're actually going to start making logical arguments as to why you believe there is a human free will, and that's not just going to summarize your entire position just because it seems plausible and intuitive, that means it's true, and that there's no need to question it, right? That's not what you're going to say?
And then on top of that, I just don't see any reason to think that that isn't how things are.
I mean, this is so fallacious. You could take that and apply it to anything, right? Any moral issue, any philosophical issue, really. You could say, okay, this is the way it comes across to me. This is intuitive. It comes across actually not just to me this way, but to most of us this way. There's no real reason to question it. It must be true. And it is the onus of proof is on the person who is trying to prove that something is so, right? So if you want to come into the picture and say something which is going against the current, like, okay, it seems like we have free will, but we actually don't, that's where the proof is. But even so, I see people take the initiative in making arguments on other issues, even when the onus of proof is not on them. And for some reason, that's really just something you don't see at all here, and that is a little bit disappointing.
And given that it matches our experience really well, and given that I think we have good reasons to think that is how things are, my next thing would just be to say, well, why not just accept it then? I think compatibilism is often put forward as a way to make sense of free will.
I think compatibilism comes forward because people want free will. They don't really understand what it is. They don't know why they want it, but they feel that they must because they associate being free with a state of goodness. And it's true, being free, like being unchained or having your individual liberties to life, liberty, and personal property or whatever. Like in that sense, being free is absolutely good. But free in the sense that you have free will, that all of your wants and that your actions, therefore, which come as a result, they come corollary and corresponding to your wants. The idea that must be free, that needs to be free, that there's some sort of reason we should crave for that to be free, is frankly unnecessary, and there's no reason at all for it. And so I think compatibilism arises when people think we don't have free will. They see, okay, yeah, there obviously are clearly influenced wants and actions. There are deterministic elements everywhere you look in this philosophical issue. And at the same time, they want that sense of freedom. And so then they say, okay, well, in some sense, we're free, and that it feels this way or this way. And Joe Folley mentioned right now, he said, there are some ways that possibly nobody has ever heard before, so maybe he's going to bring up something new, and we're going to hear an interesting compatibilist position. But I think that's actually where compatibilism arises from. People cling to this idea of free will as though they must have it. And I think that stems from people not really understanding what free will is. Because when you understand free will is, you see, as Alex O'Connor said, he said the idea of free will is like a four-sided triangle. It's impossible as a concept. Right? Like, if to use an analogy with Newtonian physics, like an object that does not have force acted upon it will not move. Will exists because of something that came antecedent. It's not just something that springs up out of the universe. That'd be like energy just springing up out of nowhere. So when you understand what will is and what free will is, you see very quickly that there's no reason to desire it, especially not to the point where we're getting emotive and making emotional these arguments based on intuition and a vague sense of wanting something and not even knowing what it is, and therefore we're losing our ability to scrutinize and be intellectually serious about what is an important philosophical subject. And of course it's important because why does anybody become successful in anything? Why does anybody become unsuccessful? Why are some people happy and unhappy? Well, these things come as a result of what they do. And what do? That comes as a result of what they find themselves wanting. So to understand human behavior, human action, and the results people end up in with their lives, we're talking about will. We're talking about volition. This is really important. And so we absolutely should be serious about it in that way.
Door open, just in case sort of determinism turns out true, however that could ever happen. I don't think it could, but even so, just to sort of think that I can both accept determinism of some kind, but also maintain free will. Now, one slight thing I should say, since Joe brought it up, I think there is a genuine conceptual difference here between a causal determinism and non-causal determinism. And so I'm a libertarian in that I think free will kind of requires, at least our intuitive notion of free will kind of requires not that we haven't got causal determinism. Non-causal determinism, I'm happy to...
Can you just flesh out what the distinction is there?
Right, yeah. So if we think about determinism being given some information, some other information must also be the case. So we see a relationship between two different facts, such that the truth of one simply leads to the truth of the other. So we see this most clearly in logic or in mathematics, things of that sort, where given one thing in some process, another thing just has to follow. So if you have the function of squaring in mathematics, and if you have an argument of 3, the squaring function in 3 determines 9. Okay. But there's nothing in that is causal. There's no causal relationship. It's not that 3 and squaring cause a 9. They simply are 9.
I see.
So there are lots of kinds of relationships that are logical or mathematical in nature that don't have what we take cause to involve, which is something like a push, something like a forcing, something that's related to time and sequencing in a way that kind of restricts or restrains. And I think that's quite an important idea to keep separate from our simple idea of determinism.
So we are here in the mainstream with a libertarian, with a compatibilist.
That's kind of okay, but the fact of the matter is your actions do directly come a corollary to your wants. So there is a direct causal relationship there. So, I mean, it's A leads to B, not just leads to, but A necessitates B. B is necessitated by A. They come as a result of each other. It's like a set of dominoes. So this other sense of determinism he has where things are just abstractly connected in some way or have a relationship due to some shared property and their ability to interact with one another, I would say is not applicable when it comes to human behavior and thinking about volition.
Maybe we could just start on agreeing where we disagree, which is with this deterministic incompatibilism or the view that we don't have free will. Because I think when we go online, it would seem that everyone disagrees that we have free will. And Nathan, I know you've recently put out a video on this, responding to Alex O'Connor. What are some of the common reasons people put forward for thinking that we don't have free will at all?
Well, I think that in many ways, it's been marketed as being where the science leads. So certainly in my engagement with the question so far, it's been predominantly in terms of the philosophy, looking at it from a conceptual point of view. Do we have any sort of conceptual reasons to think that free will is incoherent or something of that sort?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you exactly why free will doesn't exist. There are 2 points in any decision-making process. There's first the onset of want, and then there is your action, which comes corollary and corresponding to that exact want. And you don't choose what it is you want to want. And because your action is always in alignment with your want, you don't choose that either. So at no point throughout the process do you have a free will. No point are you able to exert a free will and therefore create inaugural impact. By that I mean an action that is underived. So uninfluenced by something that came before it. Or you could say, okay, perhaps something is influenced, but there was still some sort of element of control. No, there's in fact no element of control. It is directly influenced in the case, in the same way that the B domino has no choice but to fall over when the A domino hits it, and it has no choice but to fall over in the exact same way that it does. And if you reset the variables and you reset the experiment, you keep all of the elements and data points the same, the B domino will fall over in the exact same way, and it will land in the exact same spot, and it will fall at the same velocity. And human action is like that. It comes from the want, and the want is something you don't control. It comes from your biology, your superego, which would be the culture you're raised in, all of those societal constraints and expectations, and it also comes from the way you were brought up, your upbringing from your parents. All of those things contribute to your psychology, and it forms your wants, and then your actions come as a result of that. And we could break it down even deeper. Like, that's just a basic surface level observation of, okay, how are the actions actually working? But you could look at it biologically. You could say, okay, the ego, this element of you, what does it mean, not to be Jordan Peterson, but what do you mean by you, right? You, this ego, this part of your body, like, that I'm talking to when I call your name, I'm not talking to some back portion of your brain, some biological instinct you have to eat food or to go to sleep or something. I'm talking about that part of you which sits closer to the figurative forefront of your consciousness, which you have a personal affinity and identity with, right? So the part of you that wants to dance and sing and has values and has certain political inclinations and stuff like that, that is you, your ego. But the thing is, the actions that we attribute to the ego and the wants that we attribute to the ego, they are not separate from the other actions and wants that we have in our brains. So something like your desire to, I don't know, scroll on Instagram Reels for 3 hours when you know you should be sleeping because you have a test tomorrow, that is not a desire that you would probably attribute to your ego. You would be like, oh, crap, I feel like I want to do this, but I actually don't, right? Like, some part of my brain wants to do this, but I don't. My brain wants to do it, but I don't. Okay, well, what do you mean by that? Okay, I see what you're kind of saying. It feels unintentional. Okay, but then there are some actions that you completely identify with, right? Like I said, the singing, dancing, political views. You feel like that's you. That, in fact, defines you. And then there are some actions that fall in the middle of the spectrum, and it's kind of unclear, okay, where does the brain end and where do I begin? Am I going to draw a line somewhere in this process? Because like many philosophical issues, we say, where should we draw the line? Wherever you draw the line, it's going to be arbitrary because you are the brain and the brain is you. So it's impossible to separate the ego from your biological organism, from your animal organism. So you could make arguments there, and that is absolutely all 100% true. No matter how you slice it, there is no free will in the sense that this guy is trying to say there is. And I think the sense that this guy is trying to use when he says there is free will, that is that definition of free will which we should actually be using, not some consolation prize like, oh yeah, all my actions are actually determined, but if it feels this way, so I actually have free will. No, like, according to the actual definition of free will, which I've already given, your actions and wants being underived and your ability to create a new causal chain, that is impossible. That's the definition we should be using. And I say consolation prize, like I said, because these guys, they want free will because they don't really understand what it is. They have some sort of notion that it's valuable. So they feel the need to console themselves with a form of compatibilism. Totally unnecessary.
Because the sort of mainstream people that are putting forward the no free will on YouTube, I mean, I'm thinking people like Robert Sapolsky, people like Sabine Hossenfelder, people like, Alex is in his own category, but they're often coming at it from the scientific side, and sometimes I think, in my experience, without the kind of philosophical awareness that some of the things they're putting forward are more kind of assumed in science as a means of interpretation, rather than being what science demonstrates or proves. So I think the first thing I do, and I purposely brought these two books along that I think is quite important to realize, which is that this is the Oxford Handbook on Free Will, and it's.
I thought Bro bought
You
the
betrayed your side.
the Bible
I
for a
have
second.
betrayed my side, but this is sort of 700 pages. It's tightly argued. There's a lot of information here. It's considering a whole bunch of different issues that are involved with free will. You can't really consider free will separately from questions of causation, as we've discussed. There are various theories of causation. Only under some theories would free will be threatened. Questions about the nature of time, as I've hinted at as well. Originally, I was going to bring 3 of these books, one on free will, one on causation, one on time. But really, I'm just trying to get across the complexity of the issue. Whereas the sort of stuff you get on YouTube is more like this one. This is Sam Harris's free will pamphlet that is the sort of thing lots of people have read, that make a very sort of quick, open and shut case as though it's a settled issue. We only need to think about a couple of things and we can recognize that we don't have free will. So I think as much as Joe and I will do our very best to keep things at a level that is sort of more generally accessible, I think it's really important for people to realize that if they could take one thing away, what I'd like them to take away is that it's not a settled issue. It's not simple. There are a whole bunch of wiggle room in various ways. And so don't believe everything.
Yeah, I think these guys are looking for wiggle room to try and form a position that there is actually free will. It's not settled. Once again, this is a type of given up weak argumentation you see when the position is not strong from the other side. He's saying, oh, actually there is wiggle room. There's a conversation to be had. Like, okay, if there's a conversation to be had, let's have a conversation. What, you want to have a conversation back and forth about how there's a conversation to be had? We're here having the conversation. Go and make some point as to why there's actually free will. And you just don't see that. You see a lot of emotional, we can kind of do some, there's still, we can look into these little things and we can play these little games back and forth about how, well, it feels one way or there's some sense in which something happens here. There's no concrete argumentation. I think that kind of reveals the weak ground that the other side is standing on when it comes to the free will conversation.
Hear online or see online or things said by people just because they're wearing a white lab coat.
I actually remember reading Sam Harris's Free Will as a teenager, and I remember one of the arguments he made was the idea that our brain activity can actually predict our decisions before we have a phenomenological experience of making them. But he also sort of asks us to introspect and about our own ideas, because, right now I'm speaking words, but it doesn't seem like I've deliberated over them or that I've chosen them. So I wonder what you make of those kinds of arguments or points that he raises.
My wife stopped trusting me because I never do the things I say I'll do. She just does everything herself now.
Bro, the AI
I
slop
finally
has
found
to
out
go.
why.
The AI slop has
so
to go.
I think this is where you are now asking questions a little bit more about the science. From a subjective point of view, before I get to a little bit of the science, I just completely disagree with that. I don't think, I've heard Sam Harris say things like, well, when you look at how you think, these thoughts just sort of pop into being. That certainly doesn't seem to be my experience at all. I think that when we're in this state of deliberation, which is very important to libertarian conceptions of free will.
Yeah, you're deliberating between two options. Where do either of those come from?
Sort of a train of thought that is sort of directed. I might think, what do I want to have for dinner? I could betray the fact that I'm a married man, but if I'm by myself, I could go to a kebab shop or pizza or fish and chips, something like this. And then what happens is I think, fish and chips, and I think,
Yo, Folley is locked the fuck in.
No, I don't feel like fish and chips. Well, how about kebab? So you go through this process that you are different parts of your mind are evaluating things in different ways. Sometimes we're evaluating things in rational ways, thinking about how that aligns with our future plans. Sometimes we're thinking in emotional ways. How do I feel about this? When I think about fish and chips, do I think, oh, yummy? Or do I think, oh, actually, no, it's too fatty? So there's all this sort of stuff that's going on in the mind that is sort of part of this sort of direction and movement going somewhere. And as far as the science goes, I've been talking recently to Professor Peter C., who's a visiting professor at Cambridge at the moment, but he's linked to Dartmouth in America. And he's put out a very thick book just 2 years ago called the Neurophilosophy of Libertarian Free Will. And he basically argues that what Sam is saying about the brain is completely wrong. So that what we see in the brain is that pretty much the process I've described is what is going on in the brain. There are various different control centers. Some are related to when we feel like we're in control. They're the volitional centers. Others are centers like the imagination, which sort of spits up possibilities and options. And then we have other parts of the brain that are more linked to our emotions that can see what they feel like and either eliminate some or not. So I think it's again, you can get a very simplistic idea of what's going on in the mind. There's sometimes too simplistic and leads to these very fast conclusions that might not actually be how things are with the science. So anyone who wants to look more at the brain science from an alternative point of view, they can certainly look up Peter C's book, and he's debated Sapolsky and stuff on all this as well. So again, there is definitely not, I think, an open and shut case against our subjective experience coming from neuroscience.
Okay, so what is your case? What is your conclusion? You just want to tell me that there is no conclusion against you?
Oh, is there anything you'd like to add on that view that we don't have free will?
Not so much. I mean, I think that the Libet or Libet experiments are interesting. I looked at them a very long time ago, so my knowledge of them will be a little bit rusty. Something I would say is that I'm always a little bit hesitant as to placing an awful lot of weight on neuroscientific discoveries just because neuroscience is a very, very young field. That's not to say that we shouldn't reference them. I absolutely think we should reference them. I think that it's important to again bear in mind the kind of youth there. Also, the fact that when an fMRI machine is studying someone, it's not studying kind of neural activity; it's studying blood flow to certain areas of the brain and things like that. We are looking at things a few steps removed from the actual activity, just because of our best measuring apparatus is still quite young. I mean, this isn't to demean neuroscience at all. I think it's very, very interesting. I was talking to a neuroscientist called Tommy Blanchard, who actually kind of disabused me of some of my ideas about the accuracy of our measuring technology. Because again, he pointed out, but also it's worth bearing in mind that the first sophisticated fMRI scan took place in the 90s. So we really are I say this to people largely in the context of philosophy of mind. When people say things like, it seems that the mind could never be translated into brain terms or vice versa, I tend to say, well, neuroscience is a very, very young field. This is like saying that we should give up on physics 30 years after Aristotle wrote physics. This is a very, very young field, and I think we should allow it the chance to grow. But I'm kind of bound by consistency if I'm going to...
I don't think you even need to look into all these little biological arguments that say, okay, here you have an impetus in the brain, and we can detect it however many nanoseconds before you even realize you have it, and then begin your action. So it couldn't be of your free will. That type of stuff is cool. I don't think you even need to do that. I think once you have identified that the ego cannot be separated from your organism, and then in addition, when you determine the necessary preconditions for free will, like, for you to have free will, your action needs to be uninfluenced. Okay, well, where does influence come from? Influence comes from the information that you are interpreting. Where does that come from? It comes from your senses. Okay, those are always active from the moment of your birth and even before in the womb. Okay, and what interprets that information that is granted to you by your senses? Well, it's your consciousness, and your consciousness is always working. So what would we need for free will to exist? We would need to be uninfluenced by that information we're receiving, and then by our active working brain, which is taking in that information, and automatically ranking that information, ranking different choices that we could seemingly possibly make based on how well they would succeed in our goal of human flourishing, in our axiom of life as a value, our instinct of self-preservation. So in order for free will to exist, none of that could be happening because we are already influenced, right? I use this example somewhere, but when you're born, you already think like it's bright. Your body is giving you an instinct to say it's bright. And what does bright mean? Bright is a relative, comparative term. It means brighter than it was in the womb. And so you have this urge to close your eyes and scream and stuff. That action is not of your free will. And it seems like, okay, yeah, babies don't have free will, children don't have free will sometimes. Where does it develop? And once again, we're left to try and draw a line somewhere that's going to be arbitrary. So you're drawing a line in that development in that regard. You're trying to draw lines between the ego and the id somewhere. And in any case, it's all arbitrary. And then when you look at the causal arguments as to why we don't have free will, you realize that want is determined and action is determined directly through your want. It's abundantly clear that this free will that we're searching for some reason, just doesn't exist.
That to the non-physicalist, that I should also adjust my credences for particular experiments that, as far as I can tell, seem to have been methodologically questioned by people who know more about them than me. So again, that's about as much as I can say, largely due to lack of knowledge rather than anything else. I think that the way that this is debates often put in popular discourse, I think really does elide the difference between the causal and the non-causal parts, partly because they superficially seem very similar, right? So you quite often hear people say things like, Laplace's demon. Is it Laplace? No. Yeah, no, it is. Yeah. Sorry, I was getting confused. Laplace's demon, where you imagine a demon that knows all of the physical facts at one point in time, or all of the facts at one point in time, and then will they know the next set of facts, the next set of facts, the next set of facts? I mean, importantly, that's not a causal story. That's actually very similar to something that St. Augustine says about God. God knows all of the future facts, and in many ways, I think that we have my position on determinism. I think we have better reason to believe in non-causal determinism than we do causal determinism. The other thing I want to say on the Liebert experiments is just that I think that if we take physicalism seriously as a hypothesis, we ought to be careful about saying things like, that wasn't the person doing it, it was just their brain. This idea of like, there's a brain state, and then later there's the person, and the person is a kind of epiphenomenon of the brain state. I don't think that's an incoherent point of view, but I think that it is a view that, at the very least, like really has a foot in dualism, right? We're saying that there's the brain, and then there's this other thing kind of hovering above the brain, and the brain takes causal priority over this thing, but they are separate. And I don't know, if we take a kind of monist, not even a physicalist story, just a monist story of the mind seriously, then I think we ought to be careful about saying things like, this person didn't cause it, it was this brain state, because surely that brain state is part of the person. That's kind of,
because, like I said, you are the brain and the brain is you.
If we're taking physicalism seriously, that seems to be part of what falls out of that view. Now, you might think that's a reason to reject physicalism, but at the very least, I think that if we're going to be monists, let's say, then that's something that we ought to take seriously. And then I think some of these pessimistic conclusions just start to look a lot less pessimistic. You can look at someone's brain and predict what they're going to do. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I can look at somebody's past behavior and predict what they're going to do. These are all sorts of kinds of.
That's true, but the people who are using brain scans to try and predict behavior and are using that data to assert determinism, that argument is really different from the type of prediction you make when you're doing something in a prediction market, or you're saying something like, okay, if last time this guy chose some sort of option like A 7 out of 10 times, he has a 70% chance to do A in the future, like if you're playing poker or something. Those arguments are different because the guys who are using the brain scan, that is a direct causal argument where they're saying there's a link between one thing and another, and they come B comes directly as a result of A. So it's different than just making a prediction based on probability.
Determinisms, yeah, I'd say that these can be easily be fit into a non-causal deterministic framework, but I think that there seem to be important senses of free will that survive that. And I think one way of getting at this intuition is to think about the kind of things that even under a deterministic world, let's just like say by fiat that we live in a deterministic world, well, what are the kind of things that we would still want to do? What sensible notions will we want to reconstruct under determinism? And one is something like the distinction between a wills decision and a non-wills decision. So I mean, I've never met an incompatibilist who thinks that, for example, things like consent aren't important under a deterministic point of view. And so there is some distinction between whether somebody wills something or doesn't will something, even if that will is determined. And I think that a lot of kind of post-determinism
That's true. Determinism is not incompatible with the moral philosophy of individual rights.
Determinism, compatibilist arguments are kind of about this distinction between, okay, what about this question of what distinctions seem to survive, even if we accept that everything is determined in, I think, a non-causal sense. And we can maybe talk a little bit about why I think non-causal determinism is a little bit more promising than causal determinism. Maybe. I mean, I think that I mean, one of my heroes, and I wonder a very, very early compatibilist is David Hume, who is a non-causal determinist and a compatibilist. And he can't be a causal determinist because he doesn't famously skeptical about causation.
Yeah.
This is why I think a lot of determinism is non-causal, and I think that again I think a lot of the pessimistic conclusions about determinism fall out of this idea that we are. I mean, we've got actually. I haven't read this book unfortunately, but we've got it there. It's like a kind of puppeteer image, which of course is the idea is that we're being sort of puppeted by something else. Which seems to be the kind of thing that relies on specifically causal determinism. Yeah. It seems to me that non-causal determinism doesn't give rise to this sort of puppeteering image, but I think that the arguments for non-causal determinism are perhaps a bit stronger.
Yeah.
If you want to understand how things work, especially these days,
Let's keep waiting around for those arguments as to why non-causal determinism is plausible. It seems almost an oxymoron, right? Non-causal determinism. So an action is not completely determined by that which came before. But we'll see what
Just a
Joe
few
says.
minutes a
Maybe he'll
day,
actually say something interesting.
Yeah, can I just say something else on the Libet experiment? Because I think this is important. And I think it's important to get out early because I think so often people immediately shut down to the possibility of free will because they think philosophers can say what they like, the science says otherwise. So you'd mentioned about Sam Harris.
Like this guy, Nathan Hawkins, earlier, he was talking about a sense of non-causal determinism. And he said, you can have 3 and the relationship of squares, and when they interact in some way, you end up with 9. I don't know if I would even call that determinism, because things can be related, they can be connected, but not necessarily determined. Right? Because what does determined mean? It means it's the dominoes. It's A falling into B. So this other sense that they're talking about with non-causal determinism, I don't really have a liking for their classification of it as a determinism at all.
We can predict people's behavior before they do it. Now, from what I understand, from talking to Peter C. and others, is that there are 2 kinds of experiments that might be referred to. One was when people were asked to choose left or right. There was, by analysing the brain beforehand, there was above chance success at predicting things correctly. But only about 60% of the time they got it right. So that was considered more than above chance. But as Joe has been saying, the claim is that just is because you can see in the brain certain biases or probability distributions. And that's no different from I can pretty much predict that Joe was asleep at 3 a.m. this morning. Now, that's not something he was determined to do, but it's just because he's a human and we tend to be awake during the day and asleep at night. So
Yeah, that's why that's a lame argument. I mean, you have to break down where the want came from, and you find that it didn't come as a result of your ego. You don't have to look into a brain scan to determine that.
there are certain things that you could recognize in the brain that way. So that doesn't rule that. It's not as though, I think people have this idea that you can look at the brain and you know exactly what someone's going to do completely certainly, but that certainly is not the case. The Libet experiments themselves are actually quite different. The sort of thing that Joe's alluding to is correct. The claim is they start by recognizing an increase in readiness potential. Well, basically, they got people to sit in front of a screen wearing a scan, and there was a spinning clock, and they were told they could at any point press this button. And when they first had decided to press the button, note where the clock was, and then press the button. And what they noticed was that before, when they said they made the decision, there was an increase in readiness potential, then there was a decision, then there was a button pressing. And Libet concluded that the readiness potential raise was what was causing the conscious decision and causing the motor action, not their decision. Now,
no, it's not that the readiness potential increased. It's the fact that they had a desire, which led to the action. Where did the desire come from?
If you know how causation works, the fact that you have three events, one after the other, does not mean that the first caused the other two. The way you determine whether it is by turning off the various bits and seeing what happens then. And this is exactly what Peter C. had done in other experiments. So on the one hand, they asked people to make a decision and note that the clock would not move. And they recognize, again, the readiness potential went up, the conscious decision, but not the motor action. Conclusion, readiness potential doesn't cause motor actions, otherwise you'd see the same thing. Similarly, they then got some other people and they hypnotized them into pressing a button when they had a prompt that they were completely unaware of, and then brought them out of hypnosis. And then they were told they could squeeze the ball whenever they wanted. And they squeezed it volitionally, same process, and then sometimes they did the prompt and they squeezed it without having made the decision. They were told, well, you might sometimes squeeze because we're pulsing electricity into it. So they said, well, I didn't choose to squeeze that. So they had no conscious awareness.
Okay, bro.
Readiness potential is still there. So you get the readiness potential without the conscious decision, but the motor action. You get the readiness potential without the conscious decision, with the conscious decision without the motor action. The conclusion for that is, well, it can't be causing the other two things. What you just have is what Peter C. said would be expected, which is that you have a preceding brain activity before you have any other kind of brain activity, because that's just how the brain works. And in his opinion, the best explanation for the rise of readiness potential is it's just the averaging of brain noise, or potentially parts of the brain involved in anticipation that build up before a decision is made. So I think actually a newspaper, a very reputable one, has gone through like 9 reasons to reject the Libet experiment for all sorts of reasons that people can find if they Google it. So I don't think we have any reason to say neuroscience, therefore no free will.
I wanted to raise an objection to free will that Alex O'Connor has raised. And it's this idea that either things are determined or they are free and therefore sort of random. So either way, you sort of don't have a free will perspective. I just wondered what you made of that.
Yeah, okay, thank you, John. Well, I think we also have to be really careful.
He seems pissed. Yeah, okay, thank you, John.
I've heard Alex put this forward as a sort of a logical truth.
He seems to not
Logically,
like this
things
idea.
are either caused or they're random. Neither way can you be free. This is called hard incompatibilism, as opposed to simply incompatibilism, that it doesn't really matter if there's indeterminism. Free will just is impossible. And really, it's more of a conceptual argument that free will is an incoherent concept. The first thing to say is that no, it's not a logical truth that everything is determined or random. It could only be a logical truth that things are either determined or not determined. Not determined does not mean random. Randomness comes with this sort of idea of sort of
Folley is hype. Folley has done his homework. He's ready to jump in.
less kind of just staticky, kind of chaotic sort of notion. Certainly any kind of view of indeterminism that's built on kind of what we see going on in quantum physics, or potentially what we see going on in quantum physics, is the notion of probability distributions, or what you might call variation within constraints. So there are certain possibilities, certain things are more likely than others, and sometimes the possibilities are limited. There's only a certain number of possibilities, not always, but sometimes. Now, if you're now saying, is variation within constraints incompatible with the libertarian free will? Obviously not. In fact, that's the very thing a libertarian is saying. I mean, a libertarian view isn't that I can, if I have free will, I can fly faster than the speed of light, or I can teleport to the...
He says that Alex O'Connor's idea that things are either determined or they are freely random is false, because there's a third option. Things could just be free and coming up with their own volitional impetus. And I disagree with this, because you're looking at what that impetus actually is. He's saying it's free. It comes from an ego, separate from your biological organism, separate from your upbringing, the nature of your community, etc., etc. Okay, so it's coming from you, and it's not coming from anything else. It's uninfluenced. The question is, where is it even coming from, right? And to use this Newtonian argument, like, or analogy, if you have a train car sitting on a train track, if nothing is bumping into the back of that train car, and naturally, right, if it doesn't have an engine, it's not just going to start moving on its own. So a will that you have has to come influenced from something else. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have a sense of personhood or identity or some sense of self, and all those things are good. And we like being individuals, and indeed we call them individual rights. Like I said, that's not incompatible with a deterministic philosophical position on the issue of free will. But it is the case that this idea that a will can exist freely, as opposed to some particles in the brain moving randomly or being directly determined, is false.
Moon loan, or I can suddenly make $1 million appear in my account. It's not omnipotence. There are constraints. There are constraints in any of our decision-making processes, in any of our reasoning. But within those constraints, we have variation. So there's definitely no quick, logical, it's one thing or the other, and neither of them occur. Now, you might think there's more to be said here about, okay, so then given variation within constraints, that still is not what you need, because the constraints are not up to you and the variation, what happens within it, isn't up to you. Well, he can go one of two ways. One way is to say that given that we have no ultimate explanation for the variation, why it's one rather than another, the same thing you might get with half-life decay or quantum wave collapse or anything of that sort, you have no further answer from the physics. It's just brute. All you can say is, well, it had a chance to do that, and it just did. Now, saying that something's brute doesn't mean that there is nothing to do. It just means that it's possible that whatever determined that is outside of the system. Doesn't need to mean you're a non-physicalist, you're a dualist or anything. It just means something outside of the methodological means of accepted explanations of what's going on. As far as the physicist is concerned, there's nothing more to say. Physics doesn't account for things from our subjective point of view. So something could be brute because it's being chosen. But there's no further explanation for that within the system. But that doesn't mean it's mere randomness. What it just means is there's no further explanation to give. That's one way to go, which I think is perfectly legitimate. I'm very at home with that. But the alternative is to say that actually what we see, and this is the line Peter C. takes as a thoroughgoing physicalist, is he says that what's going on in such cases is there are constraints being imposed on our brain activity from certain centers, certain parts of our brain, and then there's variation being flushed in from other parts of our brain. So I won't go through the full physical detail. It's to do with how the synapses between neurons are set up just so, such that indeterminacy at the quantum level gets magnified up with Brownian motion across the gaps. I mean, he argues that our brains have been carefully selected for by evolution so that there is indeterminacy in our brain processes. And there are also other parts of our brain that weight the constraints of that indeterminacy. So that what you get is a bit like I described. I want some dinner, and suddenly my imagination fires up some options, and there's some indeterminacy in that. I then evaluate it, and I think, well, I don't want fish and chips, that doesn't feel right, and so on.
Folley's not impressed for some reason.
And through that process of indeterminacy
say.
and then selection criteria, then I think, if I'm going to go to the fish and chip shop, do I want one cod or two? And it leads to the next one. And
by the way, even if Folley, using his non-causal determinism or whatever, is able to argue that there is some sense of freeness, okay, cool, you have that identity, you feel free, whatever. You can have a sense of freeness. But if that sense of freeness is not the one that we're talking about when we say we have free will, then you don't have free will.
Possible options and selection. Basically, what's going on is the same thing that is put forward in the evolutionary story. Genetic variation, selection. Genetic variation, selection. Something very similar is going on in the brain, but in a way that allows us to evaluate things without the cost of having to play them out in real life and die, right? We can imagine, think, well, I definitely don't want to do that because I'll die, or I don't want to do that because I don't feel like it. That we play out the experiments in our mind, and the difference between, that Joe raises is really important, the difference between our subjective idea of, our subjective experience of willing something and merely having something happen to us, like a reflex as opposed to moving our leg, is what is it that's setting the criteria weights? If it's part of our brain that is part of our volitional control center, our executive center, we experience that as our willing, our being involved in it, setting the constraints, not in a way that prevents any other option because there's still variation, but in a way that means that we are steering the ship. So there's a far more complicated story to tell there.
It's true that if you were steering the ship, you would feel that you were steering the ship. But this doesn't mean that if you feel that you are steering the ship, that you actually are.
Again, I think this simple, determined or random, full stop, it's either completely determined, completely random, full stop, and neither way are you free. It's too quick.
This is Pocket. I never go anywhere without it. At the tap of a button?
Yeah, I mean, I try and think. This is obviously because I'm not an incompatibilist. I have to think for a second. Put my incompatibilist hat on. I suppose there are a couple of ways that an incompatibilist might approach this. Would be to say something like, okay, it seems like it's not just to do with being determined or random. There's this middle ground about probability distributions, right? They might say something like, imagine that I had a die that had 2 3s on it, but 1 of everything else, or something like that. They might say, well, that's a kind of probability distribution in the relevant way. But nonetheless, a process analogous to that doesn't sound like it would be free. I'm not totally convinced by that response, if I'm honest. But I thought, I'd put it out there because I think somebody more married to incompatibilists than I am could make an argument for sort of that weighted stochasticity is no better than randomness, in some sense. That I think we need to be cashed out quite carefully. What I imagine a more natural response to the incompatibilist to take would be to say something like, what your criterial constraints are for your different weightings there in the stochastic process of decision is going to depend on what's happened to you or your genetics or your upbringing, such that you could not be the kind of causa sui, or I don't know how to pronounce that, but I don't know, causa sui, I don't know.
I think so.
Of your criterial causal nexus. And I imagine that would be the very natural route for someone to go down. I mean, another route would be to say that, okay, let's imagine that someone has, their criterial causal nexus set up such that they have a 60, what's the example that C uses? He says, name a female politician with red hair, and someone might say Margaret Thatcher. Does Margaret Thatcher have red hair? I think.
Yeah, she did.
Yeah, Margaret Thatcher has red hair.
I was going Jen Psaki.
I mean, neither were you, though. So,
I was.
were you? Oh,
I was.
You look very young.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe.
Margaret Thatcher or Angela Merkel, right? And that's I can't think of another.
Nicola Sturgeon.
Nicola Sturgeon. See,
Angela Rayner?
Never noticed.
She's a redhead.
Of course, Angela. Can't believe, I see. I just don't notice.
Angela Rayner,
whether people
yeah.
have red hair. Anyway, but so you've got and say that somebody's weights were such that they had a 50% chance of choosing Margaret Thatcher, and then they had the remaining 3/6 or whatever of weighted equally between the other 4 candidates. Well, let's say we then run that simulation back 10 times and we find this particular weighting. Well, I suppose an incompatibilist could ask, does that seem to actually make them any more free? I think that when an incompatibilist is talking about free will, the picture that I think they have in their head, and again, I suppose I'm kind of mind reading here, so what do I know? But is something like, it's not merely a probabilistic distribution. What it is it's like if you were to run the situation back, someone could deterministically pick any number of, say, these 4 options. And they would, without needing to set down a probabilistic distribution in advance, if that makes sense. So that's what I think they have in mind. Now, I think that probably, I don't think we need that for much of what we actually want from a theory of will, like a significant portion of moral responsibility. But that, when I listen to hardcore incompatibilists, that seems to be the picture that they have in mind.
Yeah, I think what's happening there, though, is that I would say back to them, do you think there is a you? Like they seem to place this idea that, well, it has to be you that's doing it. It can't just be the probabilities of running. It can't just be some constraints, but it has to be you doing it. Well, what is you? They either probably deny that there is such a self because they're purely thinking in physicalist ways and non-self, or they'd have to say, oh, you are your brain, or you are maybe the volitional executive function of the brain. Now, if they say that, then the executive function of the brain is the one that's putting the criterial considerations on there, right? So I think that the intuition is there is no self, and it's being dressed up in there is a self, and the self can't be involved in free will. If there is a self, tell me what the self is. And as far as I'm concerned, it's going to be involved in the criterial setting or something of that sort.
I think this is why when I talk to hard incompatibilists, kind of in the popular sphere, I get the sense they think of it as a rather minimal position. And I think this is why they think of it as a rather minimal position, because I think that they're thinking of this kind of the thing that causes itself and that kind of hovers above our physical processes and say, well, that doesn't exist, so free will doesn't exist in any meaningful sense. That's why I think that's one of the reasons why I think hard incompatibilists very sure of their position. I think they think of it as rather minimal. It's similar to what I remember when we chatted before. We talked about Van Inwagen's idea about I've forgotten his word for it. What's the word? The
Consequence argument.
yeah. No, the I can't remember the untouchable. No, what's
Oh,
the...
right, yeah, the untouchable facts.
Yes, that's it. And saying, if you hold the physical laws fixed, and if you then say, and if you hold the physical laws fixed and you hold all the past facts fixed, then you'll be able to perfectly predict the future. And you said that does work, but it's quite trivial. And I kind of think that is often what I think that kind of trivial non-free will sort of is what I think a lot of hard incompatibilists are going for. That's why I tend to say that if that's all that they're trying to demonstrate, then I think
Yeah, it's far from trivial. That's actually the crux of the issue.
the next question is, okay, well, to what extent did all of our notions of responsibility or will or choice or consent rely on any of that? And my argument is that actually we have good reasons to think that quite a lot of this, we can salvage quite a lot of this even without this kind of, I'd say, dualist conception of the will. That's what I think. I think that in a lot of ways, you and the incompatibilists, as I understand them, aren't necessarily disagreeing as much as you think. Where I would agree with your position is that I think the leap from the expunging of this, what I think quite magical picture of the thing that kind of causes out of nowhere, hovering above our physical bodies, I just think that not nearly as much follows from that as the incompatibilist might think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I think so. So I'd say that Roderick Chisholm is a libertarian who has a kind of free will that is similar to, I think, what you're saying the incompatibilist assumes must have, where, and I think it's the one that Ben Shapiro...
How many kinds of free will are we talking about here? It's like there are more flavors of free will than there are Power Rangers, right? And I think we have to go back to defining free will, as I did at the start of the video, and then arguing on that specific point, because free will is not a gradation. There's not a gradation of your ability to create inaugural impact on the causal current and therefore to start a new causal chain completely underived. There's no gradation there. So there's no gradation when it comes to free will. It's either you have it or you don't, and we can be very clear about what that is, and otherwise I think we're just fooling around a little bit and we're not really getting to anything.
Defended against Alex O'Connor on this show of yore, where the idea is there's a soul or there's some additional thing that is the one that makes the difference. Now, in Chisholm's example, he has a Humean conception of causation. So all causation is that one thing happens here and then this thing follows. It doesn't have to be a mechanism in between. And then the idea is that you go back, what caused the rock to move the stick? What caused the stick to move the hand? What caused the hand to move the muscles, the brain? And then at some point you say, and what caused the brain to fire like that? The person, the agent. So there's this additional entity that is the...
How the fuck did they get that? So your hand moves, or rather the stick moves and your hand moved the stick, and what caused the hand to move? Something in the brain, and then from there they go to the person? Well, the person is the physical body which enshrouds the brain. So I don't know how they went from the brain, which is sort of the more primal undergirding of your consciousness and that which you consider to be your ego. I don't know how from there they went back to a sense of personhood. That just seems implausible to me that one would lead to the other.
Of the initial spark, that may be the causa sui thing. Now that he says that's fine, it's just a different kind of causation. Some causation we think happens between physical processes and events, but then there's this other kind of causation called I think it was transient causation, between something outside of an event who's not an event that starts an event. I think that's conceptually plausible. A physicalist is going to rule that out. But if you rule that out, then what you're saying is you stop at the brain state, right? There is nothing, at least if PDC is right, and previous to that was some indeterminism, there is no sufficient cause prior to that. But then you've got to say, well, what is you? Well, you have to be your brain or something in your brain or as part of your brain. And as soon as you say you're part of the brain, presumably you'll be the volitional part, or the part that experiences, the part that's aware and conscious and feeling and deciding. And in the neuroscientific story, that part is the cause of what follows from it. So again, I'm just thinking they either don't know what it is they're asking a libertarian to show, and as soon as I think that gets made clear, the libertarian can go, well, what? Here it is. I've got this view.
I think there's a lot there. I do think that what often the incompatibilist in popular discourse is asking a libertarian to show is this, like, I think sometimes it's pitched as maybe this. I think this might be how Tobolsky pitches it, but I've seen it elsewhere as well, where somebody say, show me the neuron that is the uncaused cause of this process, and so that is genuinely what I think is often the request.
You don't need that. All you need to know is that it wasn't you.
I suppose let's push the other side of this, because I think it'd be quite interesting, and it might draw out some of the differences between our positions as well, because the other line that I think an incompatibilist could rest on would be to say something like, okay, well, your criteria are going to be a result of genetics and upbringing, and at the very least are going to be heavily, heavily influenced by all of these factors that were very much outside of your control. And, whether or not you think there is some kind of meddling that can be done after the fact, there is, at the very least, an awful lot of non-you stuff constraining the number of possibilities that your criterial causal nexus could then...
Right, so he's talking about criterial, causal, whatever. And the point he's trying to make, he's talking about the point that determinists make. They'll say, and this is in Alex O'Connor's video, why he argues that we don't have free will. He famously said these exact words. He said, you can choose to do whether or not what it is you want to do, but you can't choose what you want to do, right? You just find yourself wanting it. I actually disagree with this point. I think he's right to some extent, but I think that you cannot even choose what it is you do. And he makes an argument in some other video where someone is trying to argue for free will, that we have it. They say, so let's say you want to go to the gym because you want to be healthy and live well or whatever, but then at the same time you don't want to because you're tired, you feel lethargic. Your brain and all your circumstances and biological factors are telling you not to go to the gym, but you act in spite of it and you choose to. And this seems like an instance of you exerting your free will. What it actually is not that you are not acting in accordance with your want to stay home and be on the couch. It is actually two separate wants that you have. So you have a want to stay home and be on the couch, and you have a want to go to the gym. And one of those wants is stronger than the other, and you didn't choose the potency of your wants. You didn't choose the potency of your want to go to the gym because you want to be healthy and you value your life and want to extend it for as long as possible, and you value the quality of life. You didn't choose for those wants to be so great. They just are, and you found yourself wanting to go to the gym more, and you had no choice but to act in accordance with it. So I'm even less gracious than some of these determinists who will say, you can't choose what you want, but you can choose whether or not to do what you want. I don't think you can even do that. And how do we know for a fact that you wanted to go to the gym more? Because we can see very clearly you ended up going to the gym, right? Nobody forced you to go to the gym. You acted of your volition, and it was your decision. And since nobody forced you, obviously you wanted to do that. So he's talking about this argument, right? You cannot will what you want to will. You can choose, kind of. It seems like you can choose whether or not to do, though. In terms of your action, you have some point of control. And determinists who make this argument, they'll say, because you can choose what it is, whether or not you do what it is you want, you have some semblance of some sort of inkling of a feeling of control. But because you don't choose what you want, you actually don't have free will. I think you would actually have some sort of freedom to some extent, and this sense of you doing something uninitiated would be justified. But in my position, I don't believe you can even choose whether or not to do what you want. I think if you look at your actions retrospectively, you look back into the past and you see what was the causer of your actions, you will find that you always do what it is you want to do. There is nothing you have ever done in life that you didn't want to do, and there's nothing you have ever wanted in life that you didn't end up doing.
In turn, constrain. I think that would be
So you have zero free will capable to be exerted at either of the two pivotal points in the decision-making process, which once again are the onset of want and your action.
where the incompatibilists would lean on. And, I don't think they're necessarily wrong to suggest that. I think that again, I don't think as much follows from that as the incompatibilist thinks, but that doesn't strike me as a particularly incoherent objection. How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think obviously there's free will, libertarian free will within limits. Of course, the kinds of life decisions you make are affected by your biology, they're affected by your society, they're affected by your environment. I mean, I'm not coming forwards here with my idealist and non-individualist credentials, but I'm happy to think that there is something like free will, in the way I'm describing it, at broader levels in terms of societies and generations and things like that. There still is this similar certain amount of indeterminacy, certain amount of selection going on. In fact, actually, I'll briefly give an example. Last week, so remember, the libertarian idea is that there are options with some randomness constraints, but sometimes things can come from outside, and then there are selection constraints, and then that can affect the future criteria that everything is judged on. Well, what happened last week? Arsenal are playing West Ham. There's a goal, and then there was a big kerfuffle in the box, and it went to VAR. And right now, you have this tiny possibility, right on a knife edge. Do they let the goal stand, and then Arsenal might not win the league, or does it rule out, and then Arsenal may go on to win the league? So you have this everything hanging on this tiny little decision that then will change the financial future of clubs, that will change everything else from then on. So we see at many different levels there are these constraints that then reconfigure things going forward, that there's something that looks indeterminate or very much variation within limits going on. And so, yeah, I'm happy to say that we are greatly influenced by these things. And our kind of job, or our bit, is to play the hand that we're given as best we can, and that we are involved in that process. My favorite philosophers call this notion of free will as part of our contribution to our self-realization. And I think there's something in that we become the sort of person that, through a kind of a build-up of all these small little decisions we make each day, they change the way our brain functions. So here's an example that Peter C. gives. I might decide to learn Greek, right? As a little decision now, and then maybe 10 years' time, I can now speak Greek. And my brain is now wired entirely differently. I can understand more. My possible options open to me change. And I think that's a very natural way of thinking. Sapolsky seems to assume that process is entirely governed by outside forces, which seems...
It is.
Bizarre. I mean...
Yeah, it seems bizarre, but do you have a logical reason to believe that it's not? I think it would be more bizarre that a train car that is sitting on a track would just start moving on its own, uninfluenced, unpushed by literally anything.
And also, I mean, do you think that this is fundamentally...
That's kind of the free will position. It seems bizarre that we wouldn't have it.
Classic or self-defeating, in the idea that, I haven't chosen my incompatibilism. Do you think there's a sort of self-defeating nature to this position?
I do. I think that's it's linked in the literature to the self-defeating argument against causal determinism. That I've done a video on. People can find that if they like. But the idea is you might be in your reasoning correct, but it would be a matter of luck, strangely, because you didn't get to. There's no sort of. It's just your thoughts are just dancing to the atoms as much as anything else. So if they happen to track onto something truth tracking, then it was just...
that's true, but my thoughts happen to follow reason and yours don't.
Luck. So even though causal determinism isn't ruled out, arguing for it is self-defeating.
I suppose... sorry.
That seems to be a non sequitur. I don't see how we got from the previous point to the following one.
Oh, no, I do want to sort of press you on your libertarian view, though, because does this...
Yeah, like I was determined to be right and you were determined to be wrong? Okay. Oh, okay, but you're still wrong, though. Have you given up on arguing that you're actually right, or we're, degrading now?
Out of other philosophical positions you hold, is it almost entirely rooted in this intuition of this kind of selection volition process, this phenomenology of your human experience? Or like, is it essentially an appeal
He's saying, do you have anything? Is it only an appeal to emotion? And really, we have to identify what are the processes which we use to take in information and compute it so that we can live well in reality. What are those processes? Well, it's reason. It's our ability to use logic to avoid contradiction, to stave off this confusion that comes as a result of that, to stave off our drowning in misery and inability, our impotence to do literally anything that comes with faith as an ideology, or intuition or mysticism as an epistemology. So we need to be very clear, right? This guy's like, do you have anything more than an intuitive appeal to emotion? But really, it's not even, you can't say, do you have anything more than an appeal to emotion? Because what makes progress in the world? Reason, right? Like actual, substantive, actionable arguments. So if you don't have those, if all you have is an appeal to emotion, really you don't have anything at all.
An intuition about the kinds of decisions you're making.
So
After watching this video,
we're 45 minutes into it, and only now is he going to answer the question and try to say something substantive. We'll see what he says. By the look of the breath he took, he's going to say, oh, no, but you don't really need to. Well, at least that's my prediction. We'll see if I'm right.
Yeah, so I think here, the neuroscience stuff that I'm talking to you about is relatively recent for me, mainly because my metaphysical position is sort of idealist, in which case I go for sort of an inside-out explanation, first of all, rather than an outside-in. But I'm not a dualist, so I don't think that we have this soul detached from the physical reality. As an idealist, this physical reality is itself mental, and it's an expression of what's going on subjectively. So to me, it is not at all a surprise that our subjective experience of considering options, deliberating and choosing should have a physical correlate, a manifestation of what that looks like to somebody else looking at my brain. In fact, we'd expect that. So and given that many of the people I'm in dialogue with think about things from an outside-in perspective, that they believe things that we can see with our eyeballs and test with our theories more than they believe what we can experience subjectively, for goodness knows what reason, but whatever. That's why I'm now giving this sort of story as well, that I think is highly complementary to it. But if we're taking our human experience seriously, we've got to take our volitional experience seriously.
Joe, what are your qualms with libertarianism?
If we're taking our human experience, let's break that down. If we're taking our human experience seriously, which we should, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't. After all, it's all we have. He says we should take our volitional experience seriously. Now, while I agree that we should take the human experience in its entirety and try to analyze it, that's literally all we have. That's that is our consciousness. We really should look at issues individually, right? The little experiences which comprise the overall one. We can take sensory data from one, information, knowledge, concepts that we have formed through reason, and we can apply them to particular issues. So here we have a volitional experience, and while it is true as it is an experience, that doesn't mean our very first intuition that comes to us through that experience is 100% true or unfalsifiable, right? Like, people hundreds of years ago got moral intuitions that slavery was completely okay, but I don't think anybody today would argue for that, even though that was their moral experience back then. That's not a substantive position.
It's not. I'm sort of. I think that. I mean, I think that, to be honest, the main version of libertarianism that I and many others have issue with is this kind of cause in and of itself. I'm not entirely sure on C's argument between criterial causation and the way this particularly works out in the kind of stochasticity of the behavior of individual neurons, but like that might just be my problem. I know, it's quite complicated, and it may also, and it would be surprising if we had the complete story there anyway now. I think that, suppose one, again,
I really want Folley to talk about this non-causal determinism he said he was going to get into. He hasn't gotten into it yet. I was intrigued. We're now 47 minutes in. Hopefully he gets into that, because he did say that he had some ideas he wasn't sure that anybody else had shown before. So I think if there's going to be progress made today, it'll probably be when he brings up that subject.
Pick up this idea about kind of constraints on the constraints again. Because, for example, one classic thing that somebody might want out of a libertarian definition of free will would be to say to, someone who's kind of, say there's a guy, let's call him John, for example. Actually, no, let's not call him John, because he's quite a nasty guy. Let's call him like Steve or something like that. And Steve is raised in like a really racist household, and he only ever goes out in his like very, quite constrained racist community. And so he develops lots and lots of racist beliefs. I think that what quite a lot of people want from a libertarian conception of free will is to be able to say that Steve was like the original source of those beliefs, and thus Steve remains responsible for them. I think that's what kind of people are after. And I think that's when I'm kind of pushing on the restriction of criteria point. I think that effectively it seems like under your view, you kind of end up having to say that, Steve is not responsible in quite an important sense, in that it seems like the restrictions around him basically just restricted what he could have chosen, even if we accept this relationship between the criteria that the kind of patterns of his neural states would then kind of in a top-down causal way affect the kind of indeterminacy at then the level of neurons and thus at the level of action. So, I don't know, I suppose it seems like your version of libertarianism is significantly more modest than I think most people have in mind when they think about libertarian free will. But I think that might be I think that's more a factor of what people tend to picture when they think of libertarian free will, which I think is very bound up in a kind of an old metaphysical picture to do with the soul, rather than what I think most modern libertarian philosophers would argue for. So I don't think that's necessarily a sort of I think that's more just a kind of talking past one another. Like I imagine that people watching this discussion will think that in some sense, when you've given your definition of libertarian free will, they'll probably think that you've changed the subject. I don't think that you have. I think that it's just that the breadth of definitions of libertarian free will, as well as the breadth of definitions of free will generally that people are discussing, tend to be wider than people often expect, and that there are important intra-libertarian disagreements as well. Like none of these positions, like just in the same way that a non-causal determinist, as much as I'm a determinist, I'm a non-causal determinist. I would take issue with somebody saying everything is caused, because I'd say, well, I don't know, like it seems like a lot of our science at its base level involves kind of mathematics, and that doesn't necessarily seem like it's inherently causal. That's the kind of disagreement that I might have there, to say, which is very similar to Russell originally, and then people have reconstructed that argument.
I wonder how he means this idea that mathematics isn't causal. That's kind of interesting. Maybe he'll elaborate on that
in various ways. So I think that a lot of this is, I think that when people end up saying things like, oh, the person there has just changed the subject to do with free will, I think it's worth noting that it's just that the number of live positions in the free will debate are broader.
Maybe he's talking about that idea where you will have a number and then a property of a number, and how they will relate to each other. And like I said before, I kind of responded to that when this guy Nathan, a Christian philosopher, brought it up at the beginning. Like, yeah, you can have two things with a relationship in between them, and you can say, okay, that's not a type of causal determinism. I wouldn't even call that a determinism necessarily, because I think something that is a determinist is intrinsically causal. That's what something means. If something is determined, it means it's determined by something that came before it. Right? It doesn't just mean it has a relationship with something else. We would use then a different word to describe the phenomenon than determinism. But he says here,
the person there has just changed the subject to do with free will. I think it's worth noting that it's just that the number of live positions in the free will debate are broader.
Yeah, that's another problem. There shouldn't be any broadness when it comes to the depth of a free will definition, there should only be one. And it was already defined. And a relationship that something else has with something else, you could say is not caused, and I agree. I think just because two things have a relationship with each other, that doesn't mean it's necessarily a causal relationship. But that doesn't disprove this idea that things are still caused by each other. Like, if 3 doesn't have a causal relationship with the property of mathematical squaring or whatever, this doesn't disprove the idea that if there are 3 apples that sit on a table, something put them there and something led to them being there. So when you're looking at human action, we can see that human action, which is what we're actually talking about, is causal. And the want is causal. And if you don't know where it came from, then it wasn't you.
Gets kind of airtime, I suppose. And moreover, that I don't think that I can counter this a lot when I kind of give various arguments about compatibilism. We can fool ourselves into thinking that these are very, very new positions. C's argument in terms of neuroscience probably is a very new position, simply because he's using quite new information. But for example, compatibilism is as old as Stoicism, and probably much older. Because, that's when our sources dry up, effectively. It's very hard to figure out what any of the pre-Socratics thought about anything. And
what the fuck is this face, by the way? I think this is very millennial. I think American society started to decline when men made this face. Look at them both making the same. It's like little boys who had their hands caught in the cookie jar. That's unacceptable. No man should ever make that face.
There. God knows. So
man card revoked.
But, we have versions of I say from at the very least the 4th century BC. We've got people arguing if some form of determinism is true, what would survive that? And again, the Stoics are largely talking about non-causal determinism in terms of the logos, the kind of mind of the universe, in a way that is, I imagine that the many Christians watching, which I imagine there'll be a fair few. Will immediately be put in mind of St. Augustine's compatibilism, saying that even though God has foreknowledge of our actions, there are important ways in which our actions are still down to us. Now, I think some of these ideas are eminently amiable to a modern monist, not to slag off dualists, but I think they're eminently amiable to a modern monist conception of the world. We make these sorts of and largely this is trading on. If you don't like the term free will, largely this is trading on the difference between a willed decision and an unwilled decision. I think that we tend to...
Well, there has to be will for a decision to happen. Right, in the same way a train car is not going to move without any impetus. In order for you to make a decision, you have to have some sort of energy, some sort of point at which that energy comes from to drive you. And the question is that will yours, or is it something undecided? And when we say yours, we mean something you have decided for yourself. So in order for a decision to even exist, right, and of course it can be said to be the illusion of a decision because you don't have free will, there is still a will, right? There's no way you can make a decision without the element of will.
That they're on. If you don't like the term free will, largely this is trading on the difference between a willed decision and an unwilled decision. I think that we tend to accept that there are relevant differences in terms of how we react and judge and have our reactive attitudes, I suppose is the term, between somebody hitting my knee and my leg having a reflex and somebody, watching me, I don't know, beat up a granny or something, right? These And you don't have to talk, you can have this discussion within a deterministic framework. You can say things like, well, one of them represents a choice, even if it's a determined choice, whereas the other doesn't. I think these are still, you can still hang an awful lot on there. And again, I think that, again, some people in the audience might accuse me of changing the subject. I think to a certain extent I am, because I think that when a compatibilist argues about definitions of choices or freedom, if you don't like the term free will, but just freedom and will within a deterministic framework, I don't think we should think of them as saying that this original definition of free will is is fully compatible with determinism. I think we should think of them as saying, okay, let's say determinism is true, or let's say non-causal determinism is true. So that's the one I find more interesting. Given that, what relevant notions of freedom and will survive? What do we still want to be able to do under that universe? And again, an example just to demonstrate that we probably want to do something. We probably do want to maintain some distinction between a chosen action and an unchosen action. Let's just imagine a town. We'll call it Determinist Town for the sake of having a name for it. And
I think the reason that people want free will so bad is because they associate freedom with goodness. Now, of course, this is true. To be free is to be in a good state. Right? Being unfree is very bad. But the traditional images of being unfree involve a force being imposed upon you, and it comes from an external source. So let's use this subject as slavery as an example of this, right? When one person is a slave, he works for another person who owns him as human property, right? And the will of the slave owner is completely and utterly imposed on the slave. Now, of course, this feels oppressive, because the energy, that force, is coming from an external source. It feels tremendously overbearing. And when we think of a lack of freedom, this is the type of thing we're picturing. The reason why not having free will is not so scary, and in fact not scary at all, is because while you are doing something unchosen, and the source of the volition comes from within. It comes from within your own psyche, within your own biology. So when people make that distinction between something that is unfree, an action of yours that is unfree because it's coming from an external, abusive, authoritarian force being imposed upon you versus more of an internal drive that you didn't choose, you can see one is far less scary than the other.
Within Determinist Town, there are two people who are acting out. Let's call them, I've got Steve, so let's call them Steve and Dave. Steve is, they both suddenly start engaging in antisocial behavior. They start beating other members of Determinist Town, and the Determinists are sort of saying, well, I don't know what's going on here, but they're all Determinists, and so they kind of just, they respond in deterministic ways. But they later find out that Steve has acted in this way because he's got a brain tumor. And once the brain tumor is removed, Steve goes entirely back to normal. Dave, they examine from every which way. They can't find anything out of the ordinary. So I would argue, it would be useful for them to draw a distinction between the behavior of Steve and Dave, and that the distinction will be drawn, at the very least, alongside what information is rationally admitted into a model that can predict these people's future behavior. So Dave, you can take all of that past antisocial behavior, you can use it to predict what he'll do in the future. Steve, you can't, because there was a disjunct between the model of Steve with brain tumor and Steve without brain tumor. Which there wasn't for Dave. Dave, there is no alternative model. There's no disjunct in the model it becomes reasonable to use. And so you incorporate that, and that's one very minimal and appraiser relative almost way of cutting the distinction between a chosen and an unchosen decision under determinism. But there are also more weighty versions. I'm just picking that as a kind of deeply deflationary kind of compatibilism that whenever I talk to my incompatibilist friend...
I don't think that's an example of compatibilism. I don't think us as a society needing to identify which actions have a greater degree of personhood as a result of being conscious, of being lucid, of being aware of your surroundings, of not being intoxicated or inebriated. I don't think ours as a society classifying actions along that spectrum necessarily destroys determinism, right? Because we can say that all actions are unchosen. Whether you do something when you're drunk or you have a brain tumor, okay, we can put those in a separate category compared to an action you do when you're completely of your right mind and when you have all your energy and everything like that. And the reason for that is, at the end of the day, you can look at an action and see that it was caused by a want. And it's really as simple as that. So we are dividing actions that you do when you're of your right mind, of your sound mind, and actions that you do when you're under the influence of something like a brain tumor, we're dividing those into two separate categories. And what they are is should you be punished under some form of law? And it's not so much a punishment, because when you remove free will, you remove the ability to ascribe moral value to an action. And I can get all into that later, and I probably will. But ultimately, if somebody does something when they're of their right mind, like kill somebody, that is going to be somebody who we want to put in jail, or maybe we want to give them the death penalty or whatever, not because we ascribe moral value to their action and want to like punish them and get a sense of vengeance, even though we might emotively have a moral instinct, desire to do that. What we are trying to do is to create a safer society that goes along with our axiom, or maybe you don't consider it an axiom, maybe you consider it something that you emotively crave, our desire for a society in which there is human life and human flourishing. So we're dividing actions into those two buckets: actions you do when you're okay and thinking and lucid, and actions that you do when you're drunk or whatever, or have a brain tumor. We're dividing them into, does this need to be punished by law? And punished by law for the sake of keeping you off the street so you don't do something again. Because in the case of the person with the brain tumor, if he banged a pot over someone's head or whatever and killed them while he had the brain tumor, we would say, okay, this person, after the brain tumor is removed, doesn't necessarily need to be jailed, while the person who banged the pot over someone's head just because, he had a desire to do that in his everyday, will say, okay, so we actually need to do something about this person. So that's kind of why we would divide all that and treat them differently. I don't think that disproves the idea that inevitably, when you retrace the steps behind action, it is caused. And both of those actions, whether you're in your right mind or you're in an altered state, both of them were equally caused.
They seem broadly happy with that distinction at the very least, partly because it's so very minimal. So I would think about compatibilism along the lines of, let's see what we can reconstruct, rather than let's try and...
Why are you trying to reconstruct something? Why do you want free will so bad?
This notion that may not be compatible with determinism. I think we should ask that and start there, and then just see where we end up.
Nathan?
I think it's because people will feel like a slave. People will say, "Oh, I don't want to be a slave to my instinct or whatever." They have this idea in their heads of a slave who's having force exerted upon him from outside, and like I said, there's really no reason to feel that way when you're talking about your will, because it comes from within.
I was wondering if you could respond to some of Joe's questions about libertarianism.
Yeah, thank you, John. I think it's been really helpful, because Joe's been putting to me a lot of how people think about libertarian free will, and it sounds as though I'm not providing what people want. I'm not sure whether I'm not at this stage. So I'd like to say a little bit about this. So one
You're just not providing anything.
It was, which I'll just do with relatively briefly, which was the Sapolsky idea of show me an uncaused neuron. Well, if the account that I'm talking about, coming from Peter
Show me an uncaused action. We're talking about human behavior. I think that's more pertinent.
Neuroscience is correct. Well, there are plenty. They're undetermined. They fire. It wasn't determined that they fire. I mean, the neuron itself isn't like pops out of nothingness, but whether it fires or not is not determined. So you already now have something that doesn't have a sufficient cause for it, due to, as I said, the kind of indeterminate.
Whether a neuron fires or not is determined. Whether anything fires or not is determined. Like, if I have a gun in my hand and I pull the trigger and it fires, that was determined. A neuron is the same way. There's going to be genetic code or whatever. I don't know exactly how neurons work, but it is caused by something. And if it's not caused by something, if there are particles in positions because of quantum physics or whatever, and things are just indiscriminately appearing in different places, then that would be random. And that also couldn't be said to be of your will.
Across synaptic clefts and so on.
They just happen to be there in that way, and now you're responding to it, and you find yourself feeling a certain way that wasn't of your choice.
Secondly, the idea is that the criterial constraints are applied at the level of system. So these are top-down, a form of top-down causation called criterial or informational causation, which is a different kind of causation than we traditionally understand in sort of billiard ball idea of how causation works. I won't say much more than that because it gets very technical. It took me a while to get my head around it. Anyway, certainly not enough time here. So but you can go and have a look at that. And actually, Peter C. and Robert Sapolsky have debated this stuff. Okay, so then the other question is, what about Steve the racist? Steve the racist and his racist family. So I think there are certain things that constrain us that are, whether they come from biology, upbringing, society and everything. Of course. I think only an idiot would disagree with that. You basically have to think you're a god otherwise. A biological one that I think...
That's what it means to have free will. It means to be a god. Because you're creating a new causal chain, right? Like when the universe was created or started or whatever, apparently there's evidence that there was something before the Big Bang. A lot of the top scientists would agree with this notion now, supposedly. But we all exist on one causal chain because we share a universe, as far as we know. Maybe there's a multiverse or whatever. But if you're doing an action that is completely underived, and maybe I'll elaborate on this idea in the future. It's why I believe free will is impossible and you can prove it using physics. If you have an action that is completely underived, it means it doesn't sit in the middle of a causal chain. Okay, it doesn't sit at the beginning of a causal chain. It means it's the start of one. And so if you're starting a causal chain completely out of nothing, what does that sound a lot like? Well, it sounds like God creating the universe, so that's basically why it exists, and that's why the idea of an uncaused causer almost sounds ludicrous, and people will say, okay, well, there must have been something at the start of existence, the start of this reality, and that must have been some sort of God as an uncaused causer. If you want to say that free will works in the same way, then that's what free will is. It's underived action coming from an underived want. And then that's essentially what it would be. It would be the power of a god. So we would all have to have this godlike power, and we would all be creating new causal chains all the time, and that just seems really implausible.
Fine. I am incapable of finding vomit delicious or feces delicious, right? Just in our biology, that is not a live option. I can't choose to order vomit for lunch and find it delicious. Is that mean I don't have libertarian free will? Well, I don't think so. I don't think that these sorts of constraints coming, say, from biology...
Well, you can't choose to want what you want.
Um,
Also, a constraint coming from biology or your parents or whatever doesn't mean you don't have free will. Then does anything mean you don't have free will? So could you say, okay, you're constrained in this way, you're constrained in this way. How many different ways could you tell this guy that you're constrained and he would find some way to say that you have free will? Like, if you're tied up and you can't move at all, like you're actually not free. He's like, oh, well, I'm free in this way. And it's like, oh, no, you can't do that either. You're not free.
Are genuinely affect my free will. That's not the kind of libertarian free will I have. You have to have a reason, or you have to have it has to be a live option to you. But given that there are certain live options, within that scope, you're free to choose. Now, obviously, then that means you've got something like a degree theoretic notion of moral responsibility. Steve the racist, it's at least possible that Steve the racist never had the live option not to be racist if he was completely surrounded by it. There's a discussion about this, about Jojo, who's the son of a dictator, right? And Susan Wolf describes this as well. So, but interesting what her claim is, and I probably agree with it, that if you have somebody that is so constrained in this area, so if Steve the racist could never even entertain the possibility that of non-white supremacy or whatever it happens to be, then he doesn't seem morally responsible. I think that's the libertarian thing. If there genuinely was no possible live alternative option, then you are not morally responsible. That doesn't mean people might not misjudge that, but that, in fact, without that...
I suppose, I kind of...
So this guy's arguing that it's possible you can bear zero moral responsibility for something, and the reason for that, right, correctly, is because you had zero stake in the way something went, and he's somehow saying we still have free will after that?
putting my incompatibilist hat on, I might ask, it seems like then the important next question is, when do we know whether something is a live option to someone in this way? Because, superficially at the very least, the argument about the limiting of live options very much mirrors the kind of argument that Sapolsky might make, saying that, it's interesting how in Determined, it's notable, I think, how little of the argument relies on neuroscience, and how much of it is about, well, if you know this about someone's economic upbringing, you can predict this with quite a high degree of confidence. You can predict, it seems to be a lot to do with predicting based on past events in someone's experience what their future choices will be. So I suppose it would be worth cashing out exactly when something is a live option for some, or when we can consider something a live option for someone and when we can't. Like another kind of example would be like the psychopath, right? Who taking into account other people's mental states, is that ever a live option for them, or are they just constrained by that? Is that? And I mean, an interesting empirical finding on the Jojo point is when they test whether people find Jojo, the kind of constrained dictator, morally culpable. People say, or most people say that that he is. There's it's Shoemaker and Faraci who did a study on this, or it might be Faraci and Shoemaker. I can't remember which names they went on the paper, so I'm going to be annoying one of them now. But when they tested that, they found that people did actually think that Jojo was pretty morally culpable. And I think there was a scale. I can't remember where the scale went up to, but when they tested against a control group, which is just, in the Susan Moore example, would be basically the equivalent of Jojo's father, just a brutal dictator without any of the facts about upbringing. They only judged Jojo as slightly less responsible. So I don't know, there seems to be at least some, in terms of just accounting for the data around when people assign moral responsibility for things, there seems to be a sense, or that people seem to want to hold Jojo morally responsible. You might think that's justified or unjustified, but I suspect, taking this back to kind of, I know, almost psychoanalyzing the incompatibilist. I suspect that's why an incompatibilist might look at the kind of the argument in terms of what might be quite restricted criteria, and not exactly knowing when something is a live option for someone, and saying, I don't know if that looks like free will. I think it might be because when the kind of idea of free will that the incompatibilist is looking for is at least in part attempting to account for the kind of moral condemnation that we'd lump upon Jojo. And in practice, we seem to lump upon Jojo.
Yeah.
After speaking at Google, Lululemon, and NYU, this is the one thing I would focus on if I wanted to be a highly paid speaker in 2026.
Okay, so I think firstly, I consider my position to be libertarian because even the way you worded it at the beginning, if you wound back time, it's possible for different things to happen. So I'm giving you could have done otherwise, and I'm giving you sorted. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a libertarian view. Of course, now there are different kinds of libertarian view. Okay, let's think about the Jojo one. I think it's because people being asked are not really able to genuinely conceive of an individual that had no possible live option as something that they find just so fundamentally part of what it is to be human, that we are ultimately good. There's
just so much emotivity or emotionality in these statements. So like the first Joe Folley said, he said people tend to ascribe moral feelings to actions, and so that would indicate this, or they have a sense of moral scruples or moral intuitions. And then this guy here
had no possible live option.
He says it seems almost unimaginable. We have this emotional impetus, like there's no way that your action would be completely derived from something else. That just seems so implausible. And then this is after the fact that he was arguing, this guy Nathan Hawkins, he said some sort of sentiment where he was like, oh yeah, there are different versions, different definitions, flavors of this libertarianism when it comes to free will. And I think the reason that they're arguing for so much wiggle room on the definition, he's not even necessarily arguing for a particular definition of libertarianist free will. He's just trying to say that there are different definitions, and so we can't say for certain that we don't have free will, because these guys are clinging to free will so hard. They don't understand that we don't actually need it, and they don't see how it's just an unreasonable proposition.
Something that they find just so fundamentally part of what it is to be human, that we are ultimately good. There's some spark of goodness within everybody. They can't genuinely imagine Jojo being so brought
Sure,
up
but
that
that's
he
not
never
evidence.
had any opportunity to resist, never had any sense of maybe this is wrong. Now, and that may be true. Empirically, it might be impossible to be that way. Certainly as a child. He's supposed to be a child to begin with when all this happens, right? The same way, I've got a 10-month-old. I don't hold her responsible because I think she's not being yet able to choose to do otherwise. She's still in control with her desires. Animals as well, we don't hold morally responsible.
And so at some point in her development, he's arbitrarily going to draw a line at which she gains a free will. At some point in the evolutionary development of animals, he's going to draw a line. Okay, does a dog have free will? Probably not. Does an orangutan? I don't know. It's a little bit more obscure. It's unclear. Doesn't a chimpanzee? Maybe we're starting to get there. Does a human? Definitely. So again, we're drawing lines at arbitrary points. Somewhere where his daughter's 5, when she's 10, when she's 15, now she's going to have moral responsibility. And then we're drawing lines when it comes to the evolutionary development of consciousness and moral value and indeed free will. There's just nothing concrete or solid here. And I want to rewind
I've
what
got
he
a
says right
10-month-old. I don't hold her responsible because I think she's not being yet able to choose to do otherwise. She's still in control with her desires. Animals as well, we don't hold morally responsible. Although we might have to put a dog down who's particularly rabid, but it's not a moral concern. The moral concern, I think, is when we recognize that we do have a role to play in shaping the kind of person whom we are. Now, a lot of our discussion has become centered around what's called proximal.
I mean, you have a role in the shaping of who you are in the sense that you are present. You are present for your own shaping, but that doesn't mean that you are causing it.
Like, what do I have for dinner? Am I going to flick this hand or squeeze the ball now or not? But the most important kind of free will is
we're back to squeezing
what
balls.
sort of person do I create myself to become within the constraints of my upbringing, and such that I become the sort of person that ... Now, what we see is that actually the more we habituate certain things, when we're a kid, we're making those sorts of decisions. Then after a while, those decisions are settled and they no longer become live options. Like, I don't think I'm actually free to grab this pen and stab John in the eye, right? It's not even a live option to me until I just thought about it. Just because now those criteria have reweighted my brain in such a way that that's just too distant a probability. But at some point, it was possible for me to have made decisions different in the past to lead me to be the kind of person that doesn't even think not
So this guy is saying with a smile on his face, yeah, I can't choose to want what I want, but at the same time I have free will. That's oxymoronic. I mean, it's literally, I don't have free will, but at the same time I have free will. What are we doing here?
people in the eye, right? But in such cases, we hold them responsible for the sum total of the drip decisions and processes they've made in their life. And so I think this is a very intuitive way of understanding moral responsibility, that with the cards you're dealt, you are responsible within certain constraints of the kind of person you end up becoming. And that's part of our moral judgment.
Do you want to say what those constraints are, where you draw the line? No, it's impossible. It's completely arbitrary. The game is arbitrary. I'm arguing to be able to draw a line arbitrarily in one spot and so that we can't say anything. He's not trying to say anything. He's trying to say that we can't say anything because he wants free will so bad. That's what this weak sort of uninspired, unenthusiastic compatibilism is, and that's where it's coming from.
I suppose I think that there's I suppose I don't know how that story is incompatible.
Terrified that this somehow removes meaning from human life
with like a kind of determinist framework. In that, like, I imagine a determinist could also say something like, well, like a person is set on a certain path by their upbringing and their genetics, but then like they become a causal agent, like they even if they couldn't have done otherwise, right? There are still these closed loops that we have. We like for that we don't need a free will. We just need the existence of a will. Even if it's why the yeah, it can. It's why, for example, even if you're a hardcore determinist and incompatibilist, you don't actually have to stop punishing people, for example, because of course that's part of the information that would then influence someone's will and thus be part of the story that would determine their outcomes. I mean, I think that I would suggest that even within a determinist framework, you could still have those closed causal loops, and I think that would still be a way of kind of attributing a sort of responsibility, I suppose. I mean, I think that might be what people are doing in the Jojo case. They're saying, yeah, I get that, like, he had no other option, but he is still the way he is as a result of these closed causal loops, such that he is the proximal cause of further dissolution. I think people are using, I would argue that what they're doing there is they've got a model of Jojo that they're using that they can use to accurately predict Jojo's behavior, and that such that they're the kind of the information that they need in order to make inferences about what Jojo is going to do in the future is contained within a model of his character, and thus when they're judging his character, that I think that's kind of what they're doing, and that seems to me to work within a deterministic framework. I actually think that when it seems like people's attributions of moral responsibility aren't fully dissolved when they accept a deterministic framework, such as in the case of Jojo. Nor do I think that within a libertarian framing, people, I think there are still important notions of unfreedom that someone could have. I mean, the classic one is, if somebody, let's say that we're in, we've been to determinist town, we're now in libertarian town. If somebody puts a gun to my head and orders me to do something, even if I technically could have done otherwise, I think there's still a really important sense in which we'd say that that person isn't free. I mean, this is what I was kind of getting at when I talk about the kind of polysemy of freedom, free will, or freedom. I mean, I'm not that hung up on terminology. I think that when these collections of ideas like responsibility and freedom and choice, that kind of are clearly related in some way, but may not exactly be the same concept. I think that looking for necessary and sufficient conditions, I suspect we'll end up leaving something of the story out. I think that quite a lot of the time we can think of different theories, this is especially amenable to compatibilism, but when we can think of different compatibilist theories, such as, the simple compatibilist view, which is just that your choice happens and it's unconstrained, like you're free to do something so long as something isn't standing in your way and you will it. And, Frankfurtian style compatibilism, which relies on kind of endorsement from a higher state. You can have Wolf-style compatibilism, which is if you are receptive to the good, which is very cool. It's very Iris Murdoch. And you can have kind of Strawsonian, more kind of a little bit more deflationary kinds of compatibilism in terms of what would elicit certain reactive attitudes from other people. Now, all of those, I think, capture some portions, but not all portions, of what it means, of accounting for our judgments of when somebody is free, when somebody makes a choice, when somebody is responsible, that kind of triune Uber concept almost that kind of emerges out of these judgments. I think, but I don't think that necessarily we will come up with some kind of necessary and sufficient conditions whereby it accounts for every one of our judgments of freedom and every one of our judgments of responsibility, because I think this is just a polysemous concept. I think partly, we may, in many ways, be getting the direction of or we not getting the direction of of travel wrong, but I think we may be limiting ourselves if we only look at this conversation from the direction of travel as we have a notion of free will that is independent of our ascriptions of moral responsibility, and then our moral ascriptions of moral responsibility fall out of that. I think an equally fruitful framing would be to say, well, what is it that our ascriptions of freedom do, like practically? Well, one of the things that it seems like the main thing they do is that's the thing that governs our attribution of praise and blame. So another angle to look at this is to say, well, what freedom does as a concept is attribute moral blame and praise. So actually, we should start with our kind of reactive attitudes, and then try.
If you're going to argue that we should delude ourselves to hold up a social construct that we've developed as a result of a misconception that we developed as a result of a lack of information, I think that's just a really disappointing, disenfranchised, deflated view to have. And instead, I think we can look to the future. So right now we have a social construct of praise and blame, which works to some extent at incentivizing what we consider good behavior and disincentivizing what we consider bad behavior. And so you say, well, if we remove this concept of free will, how are we going to enforce praise and blame in the traditional moral sense that we do? Well, can you really? Instead, we're going to need something else. We are going to need to have people be self-interested. That could be the moral philosophy of the future. And I don't think this idea that we've always done things this way, we've always had a moral system of praise and blame. And that is what kind of upholds the fabric of our society now and keeps people from killing each other or whatever. Even if it's illogical, we can't do without it, blah, 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 blah. That just seems like a really sad view to me. And also, I think deluding ourselves is never actually an effective solution. We're always going to need to actually know, because humans get pleasure from knowing. And we're going to be far more enthusiastic about a worldview if we know that it is true, or that we at least came to it from using reason as an epistemology, rather than just doing something because it's convenient and works to uphold the system that we have for ourselves now, which we quite like.
Count for that and try and systematize as far as possible, but I think no further. I don't think we have a reason a priori to suspect that all of these reactive attitudes are necessarily going to be accounted for in a kind of logically neat way. I think that there may be inconsistencies between the two, and there may be edge cases, and I think there might be a kind of negotiating thing going on here. I mean, another way to frame the question would be to say, what notions of moral responsibility do we want? What will be most useful going forward? Which I think is, is often neglected in debates around freedom and responsibility, just because we so often think about this debate as analyzing a pre-existing thing, rather than, if we take this kind of more pragmatic framing of reactive attitudes then going backwards, we can start thinking, well, actually, what do we want to do with these? How do we want to shape them as we move forward? I know I'm just kind of opening this up because I think that there's a sort of metaphysical way of looking at the problem of freedom and responsibility. But there are other ways as well. That reactive attitudes one is a very Strawsonian way, but it has been developed further by Shoemaker. And I think that these are other promising ways of approaching the issue that don't necessarily ask what is free will, but instead ask what do our freedom ascriptions and responsibility ascriptions do? Let's try and systematize them just as things that we encounter in the world, which again I think is a very promising way and may allow us to make some headway.
So are we not even discussing the subject matter anymore?
From determinist town to libertarian town to pragmatist town.
Yes, which is one way it sets this up so nicely because I'd like to do something a little bit cheeky and a little bit fun, which is really to try to convince Joe that he should be a libertarian on his own grounds. So I think what's happened now is this is a helpful move. So Joe's now sort of saying, let's, instead of looking at this, in my terminology, from the outside in, look at the metaphysics, how things are out in the world, first get that right before we make sense of our practical uses in terms of moral responsibility and our subjectivity. Great. And that's what things like Frankfurt and Susan Wolf and Gary Watson, the reasons responsiveness people do. They're starting from our experience, and then they assume, well, that means compatibilism, because really the determinism going out there is irrelevant to the entire way in which we're thinking about things. So let's go from here. Here's why I think that actually that compatibilism is fine, and I'd accept that if we're keeping it from the subjective phenomenal point of view, but that actually that should lead you to recognize that we could do otherwise. A couple of reasons. So I'll start with this one. You've mentioned a few times that people want the libertarian to have some kind of causa sui, an uncaused cause. And you've also said that you're not really that fussed about causal determinism, and non-causal determinism is just fine. Well, if you have non-causal determinism being the kind of thing we think is going on in the world, or the kind of thing that's going on when we do physics in our highly theoretical sciences, causal determinism is what you might get from experimental science or something like that, or our moral reasoning and so on. And most importantly, as there's a long tradition, including Thomas Reid and then later Russell and Collingwood and all these other people we've talked about, to say that causal reasoning is what we deploy when we are deliberating about what to do. We're thinking, if I do that, what will the causes be? And morality is tied up, many forms of morality are tied up with the consequences of action. This is a causal notion. In such reasoning, we do not think of our own decision that we're about to make as being caused. We think about ourselves as the cause of what we do and consider what follows. So you have, I'm interested to know what you meant by causal loops before, but you certainly have a termination of a causal chain in such reasoning, such you think, I am assumably a causa sui. My action is an uncaused cause, and I think about what follows. So if we're taking the phenomenology seriously, we have a causa sui at least subjectively, and we would be the ultimate source. And then the pragmatism comes in on the top of this, because from pragmatists, there is no question about truth out there independently of how we are deploying the notions or how we are using them. So if we are using causation as an idea of flowing from decision, and if truth is what is useful or what operationally coheres with what we do, and we treat people differently in one case than another, and we think they could have done this but they didn't, so we hold them responsible, even just if it's intuitive, surely it's true that we could have done otherwise. I don't see what else you could.
I suppose I do think that in the form of pragmatism I'm most sympathetic to, the notion of truth is slightly thicker than that. It's something to do with the kind of idealized endpoint of inquiry and things like that. But I do think that, fun enough, I've been thinking about this since our last conversation, because one worry that I have for my own view is that if it is like ineliminable that I cannot think of myself other than as a deliberating agent, and there is no other way of me thinking about that, then even though I might affirm some kind of non-causal determinism for everyone else, it's questionable whether I can adopt that attitude for myself. And if that's the case, and if that does end up in our final theory, if there's literally no other way of processing the world other than by thinking of me from a first-person perspective, as
even if that's the most intuitive and forthcoming way of viewing the world, I don't see any reason why that would be the only way of doing so.
A being that could have done otherwise, like from the inside when I'm undergoing a deliberative process, then I think that does present a serious challenge for my view, at least in one case, right? At least in the case of me. So yeah, no, I haven't massively come up with a solution for that. I think that as far as I've got with it, it's been that I've been considering that that at least for all other agents, I can adopt a sort of compatibilist position, and I can kind of take into account elements or I can take into account a kind of non-causal determinism part. But I do think that you raise an important point, right? Because the reason why I think that people want a causa sui or a kind of just a source sui to get rid of the causal language for a libertarian conception of free will is because that's what things feel like from the inside. I think it's an open question whether it is ineliminably how things will feel like. I don't know. I think that it's something that I've been thinking about since we last spoke, because I've been wondering whether this is soluble or whether it is that I have to affirm that at least for one thing, namely my own experience of myself, that I have to at the very least say that there's this ineliminable approach that I have of deliberation.
Okay, so you've got like a Persian pragmatism going on, maybe. Okay, I'll chuck a couple of more wrinkles into what you're thinking and see, because I think firstly, if you take evolution seriously as an explanation for how we are what we are, then presumably our conscious theatre and our way in which we make decisions is what it is because it has proven itself useful, and it's proven itself as an effective way of
certainly possible
going about life, in which case I think a pragmatist is going to have to say, therefore true, in some sort of way. Inquiry itself is a form of deliberation, considering options and possibilities, thinking, no, that doesn't make much sense, or that sounds like a good theory, or that's got too many entities. The whole inquiry process, everything that you might appeal to me, seems to be tied up with action and deliberate. I mean, pragmatism itself is basically the claim that we should make sense of everything in terms of what we do. So if free will is on the ground floor, I don't know, and that free will intuition comes with the idea of alternatives, then that's got to be one. The second thing, and then you can push back, you'd said that you think maybe you can't eliminate yourself as an ultimate cause in terms of how you're thinking about everything, but you could deny that of others. Well, I don't know if that is I mean, it could be possible for a psychopath. I don't think it's possible for you, Joe, because I think when you're interpreting my actions, or you're interpreting John's actions, or you're interpreting the actions of everybody else, you do make a difference between ones when someone got shoved to the ground. And this is the Strawsonian point, right? You can treat people as an agent and then think, how dare they? But then, oh no, they had a brain tumor. It wasn't really
Yes,
them.
yeah. I mean, I suppose I think that's, as in, I don't think that the ability to do otherwise is necessary there. Like,
So are we now trying to make the point that because it would seem one way that that's actually the truth? Like, when somebody wrongs me, I will sometimes feel a desire to get mad at them because I'm ascribing almost involuntarily a moral problem with what they did. But I can still recognize that what their action was determined, right? So there's really no point that this guy's trying to make here.
I can get by without that. I think we can get by with a kind of proximal source notion or something like that.
But what notion do you use?
I think
What is a useful notion?
I think I use a kind of proximal source notion. Like, as in, genuinely, I think that, because if you were to prove to me, like today, you would sit down and say, Joe, I've proven to you beyond a shadow of a doubt that determinism is true. I think that I could hold that thought in my head and still, at the very least with other people, say, oh yeah, no, but I can still distinguish between choices and non-choices. Because, like, I even if somebody has, overwhelming reason, for example, like even within a libertarian viewpoint, I think that we can make this distinction. If somebody has overwhelming reason to make a certain decision, then I don't think that makes it less agential, at least from the outside, looking at their decision making. So I mean, I don't think that I necessarily need the to assume the ability to do otherwise there. I do think that the serious challenge for me comes in the first person perspective. Like when I am deliberating, I think that there's a tension here, and I think that it's a tension not just in pragmatism, but more fundamentally in the way that we do kind of inquiry as people. So like, I think Hugh Price put this argument kind of quite well, which is that we approach the world, and our kind of starting point is that we find out things about the world, and we go, there's this stuff in the world, and we can find out about it. And then we find out that we're things in the world, and we can find out about us. And then we find out that our deliberative processes are things in the world we can find out about. And then we start studying them. And it's incredibly difficult then. I think this is very much an open question. I think it is very difficult to like hang those two things together, because on the one hand, Hugh Price calls this object naturalism and subject naturalism, where you've got, you start off with object naturalism, which is just I examine the world, find out things about the world in a kind of naturalistic empirical fashion, and then I find out that I'm and other people are objects in the world, and I start studying them in an empirical fashion. Oops, sorry. But then there's the opportunity for that to not necessarily undermine the object naturalist project, but certainly recharacterize it. And I think one way of doing this is to recast in terms of our cognitive interest and stuff like that. But generally, I think this is a deep problem. The only word I have in defense of it is that I don't think it's just a problem for the pragmatist. I think it is basically a problem for everyone. When we find out that the human being is both the thing by which we're using to measure everything else, and also, from an outside perspective, the thing that we're measuring when we go and study the human mind. So I agree that is a problem, and I'm not entirely sure how to solve it. What I would say is I don't think it's uniquely a problem for my view. I think it is if not a universal problem, a near universal problem.
Yeah, I think what it does, and this might be a really good thing to end, given that we're on Premier Unbelievable, is I think when the distinction between the objective and the subjective has become blurred, there's not this clear distinction between the world out there independently of us and our subjectivity, and this is what pragmatism is getting at, this is what idealism is getting at, but idealism is already picking a side and saying, you don't take objectivity and say, oh, I'm just an object, I'm just a particle blowing the breeze, I'm just dancing in my DNA. You're actually pushing things out and saying, no, there's subjectivity in the world. Subjectivity actually runs right out into the world. Pragmatism is sort of doing this. It's a very natural theistic move, I think. And so it very naturally then seems to me to say the reason why the world seems so much like us, and the more you look at it, the more it is, this randomness selection is going on in evolution, it seems to be going on in particle physics and so on, to say the world itself is much more like a subject or a mind or the sort of thing we might perceive others to have or to be. So there we go. That's maybe a way to solve it.
No, I mean, I think that the pragmatist as far as I understand it, the practice way of solving this tends to be to roll the subjective and the objective into one thing.
Yeah.
In a way that is sort of like, I don't know, 20th century Hegel, I guess. But like, there's definitely something broadly Hegelian going on there. Dewey, I think, is a really interesting example of this. He spent his early career studying Hegel and then became one of the greatest American pragmatists. So I don't know. My point is, I'm really glad I've ended on this point though, because I do think that the place of how to not in the context of philosophy of mind, how to place phenomenal experience, but in the sense of how to treat the human being as an inquirer and also the object of inquiry, is difficult. I think that genuinely is tricky, and I think different philosophies solve it in different ways. I think pragmatism tries to solve it by melding the subjective and objective together, and eventually, placing something like operational coherence and convergence, like unforced convergence in inquiry, as kind of the proxy measure for objectivity, which I think is potentially the best we can do there. But I'm not sure how we then link that back to the free will debate. But I'm glad we got onto this. I think it's very
It's
interesting.
all related.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you've ever wondered what a Cambridge Common Room is like for a philosophy tutorial, I think we've been given an insight into it today. Whether you freely chose to come here or not, I'm so grateful.
So the problem of free will wasn't solved. Well, at least it wasn't today. It has been solved. We don't have free will. And like I said, the reason for this, our ego is not independent of our biologies. It is dependent of our upbringings, our genetics, our superegos, these roles that we take to be truths. We don't question them. Society has imposed them on us. Even if you say, okay, yeah, sometimes we do things that are unintuitive, that are challenging, that are unpredictable. That's absolutely true. Okay, then let's look into the individual action. Where did the action come from? It came from the want. Where did the want come from? Really, we diverge and we talk about these abstract notions, and we look into them, and that's fun, and we like to play around. But really, we should maintain a level of intellectual seriousness, and we shouldn't try to cling to something that's really not at all valuable. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean this idea that we should seek to have underived actions, which come from underived wants. There's really absolutely no benefit to that, and I think we can accept that we don't have free will. In the traditional sense, we are still free in that we are individuals. In every important sense of the word, in every basically real sense of the word, we are free. Just because we cannot be gods and create new causal chains, which would inevitably be in conflict with another, and I'll create a future video on that, it doesn't mean that our lives are meaningless. It doesn't mean that we can't pursue meaning. It doesn't mean that we can't live enjoyable lives. And that's really what our goal should be. So this conversation was kind of interesting. I liked some parts of it. But really, when we talk about the subject of free will, we should think into our human behavior. We should use reason. We should use a morality of self-interest. So even though we're not prescribing morality to individual actions, really it's a lifestyle guide. That's what we're seeking. We're trying to seek happiness for our own lives. We're trying to use reason to achieve certain ends. That's what we're doing here. And that is not in contradiction. That is not incompatible. That is not mutually exclusive with determinism as the position that we take on the philosophical issue of free will. And that is the correct position. So that's all I have for this video. Pretty fun. Sometimes it's cool to watch things like this. And that wasn't bad at all.